Cults never kidnap you with a black van in the middle of the dark night. They approach in broad daylight with warm smiles, targeting the absolute bottom of your despair. I am Mia, 19 years old, a freshman living 500 miles from a broken home. I was completely exhausted from brutal shifts, barely surviving and drowning in absolute silent isolation. If I simply vanished, it would take my family an entire month to even notice. They smelled that profound weakness, approaching me on the campus courtyard with promises of healing. Why did I agree to follow total strangers? I was just craving a hot meal. I desperately needed a safe place where someone actually wanted to listen to my voice. They immediately surrounded me and praised me, the classic and terrifying love-bombing tactic. When you are truly drowning, you never care how deformed the life preserver actually looks. By the second month, I was invited to an isolated eco-leadership retreat deep in the mountains. A heavy passenger van carried me and 4 other recruits deep into a dense, dead pine forest. We had completely lost cell service, plunging us into total isolation from the outside world. The moment we stepped out, the strict rules were declared. We had to surrender our identities, to supposedly remove our social labels. We handed over our phones, wallets, and bank cards. Then came the first psychological exercise. The leader ordered us to write a severance letter. We were forced to write down a complete detachment from our families, seeking ultimate spiritual purity. Overwhelming peer pressure made us obediently copy the words and sign our real names at the bottom. I dropped the letter and my phone into his heavy iron box, completely unaware of the truth. If I died in this desolate place, that piece of paper would be a perfect suicide note. The first day dragged on with exhausting meditation sessions and a strict diet of thin, watery soup. By 2 a.m, the gnawing hunger in my empty stomach finally forced me awake. I quietly slipped out of my narrow bed, planning to sneak into the main kitchen area. The converted wooden barn was completely dead silent, filled with the heavy breathing of sleeping recruits. I carefully tiptoed toward the solid wooden exit door, my bare feet freezing on the floorboards. I wrapped my fingers around the cold brass doorknob and gently tried to twist it open. It completely refused to budge, stopping with a heavy, solid metallic clunk against the door frame. I pulled out my tiny keychain flashlight, aiming the focused white beam at the narrow gap. A terrifying physical reality revealed itself. There was absolutely no locking mechanism on the inside. It was heavily secured from the outside with a deadbolt, transforming our dormitory into a mechanical cage. Our sleeping quarters were just a converted warehouse, connected to the leader's office by a thin plywood wall. My stomach churned as I pressed my ear against the cold, fragile wood to hear more. Immediately, I heard the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard and the leader's voice speaking to an accountant. Sarah's credit card has already been drained to the absolute maximum. His voice was cold as ice. Her family won't even care. Tomorrow afternoon, give her the tea laced with sedatives. Take her to the cliffs behind the mountain and leave her free will letter on the bedside table. The blood inside my veins instantly froze solid. This was never a healing community. They targeted lonely youths, manipulating them into massive debt before draining every single cent. When the victim was no longer profitable, they staged a suicide and disposed of them. I was the next prize, and my time was rapidly running out. I couldn't just vanish into the forest without my phone or papers, without a map. I was already dead, leaving my heavy backpack behind. I struggled to squeeze through the tiny bathroom window. My body hit the cold, damp mud behind the house with a dull thud. I crawled low against the wooden wall, sneaking toward the office window right after they turned off the lights. Tiny keychain flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the heavy iron box on the desk. The lid was not locked. I pried it open with a metallic groan, searching for my phone. But beneath the layer of stolen smartphones, I discovered a hidden secret compartment. It was packed with dozens of ID cards and severance letters belonging to strangers. They didn't just steal money. They kept our identities like a bloody accounting book. My hands shook as I grabbed 3 random IDs and fled into the forest like a wild animal. A passing truck driver found me and drove me to the state police station at 5 in the morning. The duty officer initially frowned in deep suspicion at a panicked 19-year-old girl fleeing a retreat. But when I pulled the 3 unfamiliar ID cards from my pocket, his face turned completely pale. He frantically typed the names into the system, and the computer screen immediately flashed a bright red warning. All 3 names belonged to students who had been on the National Missing Persons list for over a year. The physical presence of victim IDs and my testimony immediately activated exigent circumstances. By 6:30, heavily armed SWAT teams and helicopters completely shattered the quiet gates of the farm. I sat safely inside an ambulance, watching the warm, smiling leader being pinned face down into the cold mud. They rescued the other recruits just in time, as forensics began wrapping red tape around the cliffs. The most dangerous demons don't have fangs. They have perfect smiles, and they use your loneliness to dig your grave. My name is David. I spent all my savings to buy a small house, desperately trying to escape the chaotic city. Initially, the suburban silence felt peaceful until I saw the man standing across the fence. He was in his 50s, wearing a pristine beige sweater that was unnervingly clean. He waved to me with an exaggeratedly friendly smile, an impossibly wide and static grin. But when I walked over to return the greeting, a primal alarm bell violently churned my stomach. The smile on his lips was stretched tight, stiff and frozen like a silicone mask. 3 full minutes passed by. The smile never shifted, and his dead, unblinking black eyes never closed once. He wasn't looking at me like a new neighbor. His gaze was slowly moving from the top of my head down to my heels. He was silently measuring me, with a focus that was nothing short of sickening. The isolation of the suburbs reveals its cruel, true face at exactly 3 in the morning. When darkness swallows the houses, the silence becomes so thick it rings in your ears. I was deep in an exhausted sleep among the unpacked cardboard boxes, awakened by a rhythmic, rough sound echoing from below. Thud, scrape, toss. It was the sound of metal violently scraping against wet dirt, then tossing something aside. That sound wasn't coming from the main street. It was echoing right outside my living room wall, inside my own backyard. My chest tightened as I held my breath, tiptoeing barefoot across the cold wooden floor toward the bedroom window. My sweating hand grabbed the bottom edge of the plastic window blinds. slowly pulling it up to create a razor-thin gap, just enough for one single eye to look down. Tunnel vision instantly froze my entire nervous system. Under the cold, pale blue moonlight, the man from this morning was standing right in the middle of my backyard. He was no longer wearing his neat beige sweater. He was draped in a dark, heavy hooded raincoat. His hands gripped a heavy steel shovel, violently and rhythmically, driving it into my freshly watered lawn. He was digging a hole. At both ends of the mound of dirt, he had planted 2 small wooden stakes as measuring markers. The angles of his shovel cuts were perfectly sharp and squared. The chunks of black dirt he pulled up formed a highly distinct, deeply carved rectangular pit. A deep, narrow, and unnervingly long hole. He was digging a pristine grave in my backyard on my very first night here. The rhythmic digging suddenly stopped, freezing the night air instantly. The silence right now, as he noticed, was far more terrifying than the metallic scraping. From the bottom of that dark rectangular grave, the man slowly raised his head. My house was completely pitch black, with dozens of identical window blinds. But he possessed the sickening instinct of a predator, his dead eyes piercing the darkness, his gaze locked perfectly onto the 1 centimeter gap where my terrified pupil was staring back. He knew I was watching. He knew I was awake. And then, bathed in the pale moonlight, the corners of his mouth slowly stretched upwards. He formed that exact same unnerving static smile without ever blinking his pitch-black eyes. There was no righteous anger, no cinematic courage to grab a weapon and rush downstairs. The most primal, paralyzing fear had completely stripped the oxygen from my lungs. My knees turned to mud. I collapsed onto the dark wooden floor, my back pressed tightly against the cold wall just beneath the windowsill. My trembling hands shot up to cover my mouth and nose, desperately trying to stifle my frantic breathing. My thumb frantically clicked my phone's power button 5 consecutive times, activating a silent SOS to the police. From down in the yard, a new sound began to echo. He wasn't digging anymore. Scrape, drag, scrape, drag. It was the heavy steel blade of the shovel dragging across the wet grass. Slow, unhurried footsteps were making their way toward the glass sliding door of my living room downstairs. Then, a single, dry knock rang out. He was tapping the handle of the shovel against the glass. A cruel game of cat and mouse, signaling that my final boundary of safety was about to shatter. The shrill siren of a patrol car tore through the night, saving my life. The dry knocking on the glass downstairs instantly ceased. When I stepped outside with 2 police officers, the devil had vanished into the darkness. I frantically pointed at the house next door, demanding they arrest the neighbor. But when the officer shined his heavy flashlight on it, my blood ran cold. The house was boarded up tight, sitting on dead yellow grass with a faded bank foreclosure sign. It had been abandoned for 3 years. The man from this morning was a drifter, a drifting killer, casually using an empty yard to select his prey. But what completely broke my mind was when the flashlight illuminated the empty rectangular hole. The distance between the 2 wooden stakes he planted as measuring markers exactly matched my height of 1.8 meters down to the millimeter. He never smiled to welcome me. He was just using those eyes to take my coffin measurements. By sunrise, I threw a few clothes into my trunk, abandoning all the unpacked boxes and the mortgage. I drove away from that suburb forever, knowing a predator who custom fits a grave for his prey won't easily abandon his masterpiece. A house for sale sign was hung up that very day, but the feeling of someone smiling and staring at the back of my neck haunts me to this moment. They say you should never turn off the app for off-book rides at night, but safety rules are only a luxury for those who still have a way out. I am Mark, 32 years old. My daughter has been in the ICU. Her congenital heart defect has completely drained every single cent my family had left. The hospital demands a $500 advance by tomorrow morning to keep her surgical slot. After 18 grueling hours behind the wheel, I am still exactly $80 short. It is 2:15 a.m., and I am chewing dry bread in the sterile hospital parking lot. A gaunt man in a black overcoat suddenly taps sharply on my car window. He slips a crisp $100 bill through the gap, whispering about an off-app ride. My exhausted brain completely ignores the red flags, and I manually disable my GPS tracker. The exact moment that heavy car door slammed shut behind me, deep regret burned like acid. I stared at the $100 bill on the dashboard, suddenly realizing my absolute, unforgivable stupidity. I had manually disabled my GPS, severing my only lifeline to the police and the dispatch company. If I simply vanished into the dark tonight, my little girl would permanently lose her father. The heavy silence inside this vehicle became so thick. I could hear the tires crushing cracked asphalt. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat and slowly glanced up at the rectangular rear-view mirror. The blood inside my veins instantly froze solid into ice. The stranger was no longer sitting perfectly centered. He had silently slid all the way to the left, sinking perfectly into my terrifying blind spot. I could no longer see him, but I heard his slow, wheezing breath inches from my neck. He did not have to say a single word for me to understand. He was in total control. Pure panic violently shattered my paralyzed regret. My deepest instinct screamed at me to slam the brakes, but the exact second my foot hovered over the pedal, a freezing pale hand crept from the dark. That slender, lifeless hand slowly rested on the center console, leaving behind a tiny object before vanishing. My heart completely stopped beating when the pale dashboard light hit that small, familiar shape. It was a pink butterfly hairpin, the exact one belonging to my little fragile girl. For the past week, I had locked my house entirely to stay at the intensive care unit. This stranger was not a random passenger. He had been stalking my empty home and desperate routine. Through the corner of my eye, I saw his rigid silhouette slowly leaning forward from the shadows. The corners of his mouth stretched into a stiff, dead smile, delivering a silent, blood-soaked message. My desperate struggle to save her was just a sick game, and he held all the bloody strings. Hot, bitter tears blurred my vision as I stared at the dark road ahead. I could not slam the brakes and run. He knew where we lived. If I escaped now, he would simply go back for my daughter. I was trapped inside my own vehicle, a prisoner of a silent, smiling devil. We entered a pitch-black dirt path leading directly into the abandoned industrial zone. Through the corner of the mirror, I heard a faint, dry clicking sound. He was slowly pulling a long black zip tie from his heavy overcoat. The plastic loop was already formed, a noose waiting for its final victim. He was preparing to end my life in absolute, crushing silence. My promise to save my daughter was ending here, in a pool of blood. If I drive calmly into that darkness, I will die, and my daughter's hope dies with me. Love for my child crushes every ounce of paralyzing fear. My vehicle is now my only weapon. I cannot fight him hand to hand from this seat. But I have 1.5 tons in laws of physics. 2 miles ahead, I see the flashing red lights of a police way station. My final salvation. I grip the steering wheel until my knuckles bleed, ignoring the door locks and the looming threat. I floor the accelerator and the engine screams in pain. The speedometer climbs rapidly to 90 kilometers. Massive inertia pins that monster deep into the back seat, paralyzing his hands and the black zip tie. As we approach the station, I let out a roar that rips through my lungs and swerve hard. I aim the front of my car directly at the solid plastic water barrels for the ultimate impact. At the very last second before the crash, I slam my foot onto the brake with everything. The massive collision instantly reduced my speeding vehicle into a crushed metallic cage. The explosive force of the airbags safely pinned me against the driver's seat. Without a seatbelt, the monster was violently thrown forward into the shattered windshield. Flashing blue police lights quickly surrounded my completely destroyed vehicle within seconds. Through the dizziness, I desperately screamed for them to check the pink hairpin. They found a dark leather notebook hidden deep inside his heavy black overcoat. He was a grief harvester, stalking desperate families, waiting for death at the hospital. The local news broadcasted my survival story, raising enough money for her surgery. My precious daughter is finally safe. But my peaceful mind was permanently destroyed. Every single night, I obsessively checked the locks, haunted by that silent smile. When you live alone in a creaky old wooden house, your brain automatically rationalizes every single anomaly. I am Sarah, and for nearly a month, my hallway has faintly smelled of rotting ammonia. I even bought dozens of scented candles, convincing myself it was just a dead rat upstairs. Tonight, after turning off the living room lights at 1 a.m., I slowly walked toward my bedroom. The isolated space was dead silent, except for my bare heels heavily striking the wooden floor. Thud, 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 echoing through the suffocating darkness of the narrow hallway. But as I reached the exact spot reeking of cheap scented candles, my body suddenly froze. A distinct anomaly. There was another heavy sound, perfectly masking itself over my own footsteps. The noise was not echoing from the wooden walls. It was physically pressing down on me. It was coming directly from the thin white plaster ceiling, right above my head. I tried to convince my racing mind that it was just the old wooden floorboards, naturally contracting. To test this desperate theory, I intentionally stopped my movements in the middle of the dark hallway. The heavy anomaly on the ceiling immediately ceased as well, plunging the house into a suffocating quietness. The heavy atmospheric pressure pressed down on my eardrums, making my own rapid heartbeat feel deafening. I took a deep, trembling breath and deliberately took 3 fragmented steps forward across the floorboards. From the dark attic above, a heavy scraping sound immediately echoed back with the exact same rhythm. This was definitely not an echo. A mere acoustic reflection cannot carry such immense physical weight. An echo does not shake tiny specks of gray dust loose. letting them fall into my messy hair. My stomach violently tied into knots as I realized there was a physical person walking above me. He was crawling perfectly in sync with my movements, using acoustic masking to stalk me in the dark. I stood frozen like a statue in the middle of that suffocatingly dark hallway. My trembling hand fumbled with my phone, activating the harsh white beam of the flashlight. I aimed the concentrated light directly upward at the metallic air vent on the ceiling. The beam revealed dark, oily handprints, smudging the thick black dust around the edges. A faint, cold draft blew through the metal slats, carrying a foul, revolting stench. No amount of scented candles could hide it now. The smell of sour sweat and human waste. Through the narrow gaps of the vent, I saw the wet white of a bloodshot eye. It was darting frantically in the light, eventually fixing its gaze right on my head. He blinked rapidly, trying to retreat from the sudden, intrusive glare of my phone. This was no ghost. A living, breathing parasite had been nesting right above my bed. My home instantly transformed into a lethal cage. Every exit felt like a suicide mission. The main door was right at the end of this narrow hallway, mockingly out of reach. But the attic hatch was positioned directly above that single escape route, a cruel trap. If I sprinted for the door, he would simply kick the hatch and drop onto my neck. I had no brilliant survival plan. My motor skills were completely paralyzed by raw adrenaline. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the phone, my only source of light. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like a blunt knife stabbing my chest. We stood there in absolute agonizing silence, separated only by a thin layer of plaster. I could hear his heavy weight shifting cautiously, waiting for my very first move. One wrong step and the ceiling would shatter and ended my life in the dark. There was no room for a hero stand, only the primal, desperate command of my brain to run, instead of rushing for the main door and becoming prey. I backed away slowly into the bathroom. The very second my feet moved, the heavy weight above realized the prize was slipping away. A massive, splintering crash echoed as I finally smashed through the wooden attic hatch. I slammed the solid bathroom door shut, locking the thin metallic bolt with a frantic, shaky click. Heavy, rhythmic thuds immediately rattled the wooden frame. He was throwing his entire body against it. I knew this thin door would not hold for long. I turned to the small glass window. I lifted the heavy ceramic toilet tank lid, my muscles straining under its cold, solid weight. Shards of glass exploded outward as I smashed the ceramic lid into the narrow window frame. I threw a towel over the jagged edges and scrambled out, falling onto the cold, damp grass. Police sirens shattered the heavy silence, but the monster had already vanished into the night. 15 minutes was all it took for my sanctuary to be officially labeled a crime scene. In the dark attic, they found a foul nest, built from my own stolen, unwashed clothes. Dozens of plastic bottles filled with waste were neatly lined up where he had been watching. He had been lying right above my bed, listening to my steady breath every single night. I spent the night at my sister's house, wearing torn pajamas and shaking uncontrollably in the dark. I never stepped foot inside that old wooden house again, leaving my deposits and memories behind. I realized then that human senses are easily deceived by the simple, sweet scent of candles. Now I live in a concrete apartment but my muscles still freeze at every moving shadow. I always find myself staring at the air vents, waiting for a bloodshot eye to stare back. The supposed safety of a locked car at night is just a cheap and fragile illusion. I am Maya, driving home, completely exhausted, after another brutally long and draining office shift. The dashboard clock slowly flashes 11:45 as a light drizzle blurs the desolate highway. Inside, the heater hums a steady, dull rhythm, separating me from the oppressive dark outside. But then, that false peace was violently pierced by a tiny, sharp, and chilling electronic sound. Ping. My iPhone screen on the dashboard mount suddenly flared up with a harsh red glow. A stark notification from the Find My app struck me like a physical blow to the chest. Unknown AirTag detected moving with you. I frowned, knowing my backpack had absolutely nothing. My keys were empty too. In this claustrophobic space, I was supposed to be the only living thing. A freezing chill ran down my spine as I realized that this notification was no system error. My trembling hand slowly reaches for the smartphone to open the digital tracking map. A visceral wave of nausea hits me hard as the screen reveals a cruel reality. A jagged red dotted line appears on the map, tracing every single turn I have made. The starting point of that blood-red trail, the dark parking garage of my office. My stomach knots into a tight, cold ball, knowing exactly where this nightmare began. Apple does not warn you immediately about an unknown AirTag to avoid false alarms. The system needs time to confirm a device is truly following your every move. That fatal algorithmic delay gave the stalker a full hour of a terrifying head start. He breached the security of the basement level and secretly attached the device to my car. He is watching this same map right now, knowing I just lost my only advantage. The absolute first survival rule of true crime is that you never drive straight to your home. He already knows exactly where I work, and if I turn into my own private driveway, I would essentially hand this unseen predator the precise geographic coordinates of where I sleep. My heart violently hammers against my ribs as my panicked eyes dart to the rear view mirror. A few distant headlights pierce through the darkness, looking exactly like the glowing eyes of wild beasts. I quickly turn off the car heater, desperately preparing to hit the play sound button. But the constant drumming of rain against the glass creates an overwhelming and suffocating wall of noise. The loud roaring of my tires on the wet asphalt swallows up any chance of hearing a tiny chime. Even if the metallic AirTag starts ringing right now, I will never hear it from inside this moving cage. Gripped by total despair, I realize the terrifying truth. I have absolutely no choice but to pull over. I sharply steer my car into a desolate 24/7 gas station, brightly lit but completely devoid of any human life. I bring the vehicle to a sudden lurching halt right against the cold glass of the cashier's booth. The biting rain stings my face as I step out, the freezing wind instantly cutting through my thin blazer. My breath hitches in my throat as I stand there, frozen in the clinical, flickering, fluorescent glare. Holding my breath in the suffocating silence, I tap the screen, finally triggering the play sound command. Through the rhythmic patter of the light drizzle, I hear it. A weak, metallic, and muffled electronic chirp. It is coming from the dark, oily void hidden deep beneath my car's rear bumper. I drop to my knees on the wet, gritty concrete, ignoring the cold soaking into my clothes. My trembling fingers find a thick patch of black duct tape, caked in dried mud and road grime. As I rip it away, a smooth metallic air tag rolls, resting like a parasitic eye in my open palm. My first instinct is to crush this metallic parasite, to silence its digital scream forever. But a terrifying, ice-cold thought stops me dead. If I destroy the signal now, he will know. He will know I've found him, and he will know I'm trapped here alone in the light. Just as the panic begins to paralyze my limbs, a dark shadow emerges from the distant highway. A monolithic, dark gray SUV turns into the station, moving without the glare of any headlights. It doesn't head for the pumps. It just crawls forward like a silent, hungry predator. The heavy tires crunch slowly on the wet grit as it pulls into a sharp, diagonal position. It stops abruptly, perfectly blocking half of my only possible exit route. The windows are covered in pitch black tint, reflecting nothing but my own terrified face. The hunter is not miles away. He is right here, finally coming to collect his prize, without hesitating for a single fraction of a second. Survival instinct takes complete control over my body. I slam the sticky duct tape with the air tag right onto the rim of a parked refrigerated truck. I throw myself back into the driver's seat, violently locking the doors of my faded red sedan. Ignoring the dark SUV creeping dangerously close, I throw the gear into reverse and slam the gas, the deafening crunch of metal echoing in the night as my rear bumper smashes into his front grille. I peel out of the desolate gas station, driving blindly into the dark highway toward the police. The next morning, security footage from my office basement revealed a masked man tagging my car in seconds. The heavy truck carried his tracker hundreds of miles away, but the police said the Apple account was a dead end. The phantom stalker completely vanished into thin air, leaving absolutely no digital trace behind. I moved away, but the deep trauma remains. Every single time I hear a digital ping. The human brain is tragically easily deceived by fake warmth in the dead silence of the night shift. I am Elias, an exhausted night auditor with heavy dark circles, struggling to keep my eyes open. The clock strikes exactly 3 a.m, and the motel lobby feels like an isolated glass cage. My fingers numbly roll a heavy, solid brass key tag, staring blankly at the strict safety rules. Never leave the bulletproof glass counter after 2 a.m, the paper warns in bold black letters. Right then, Mr. Vance walks into the silent lobby, bringing a chilling gust of wind from outside. For 2 straight weeks, he has been our most flawlessly polite guest, always wearing a warm, rigid smile. He gently places a steaming white paper coffee cup, along with a crisp $20 bill on the counter. "Black, with extra sugar, just to help you stay awake," he says, leaning casually against the cold glass, desperate for any trace of human kindness. I greedily drink the hot liquid without a single second thought. 15 minutes slowly tick by, and I suddenly realize my tongue feels strangely numb. The familiar edges of the lobby start to blur as a heavy weight crushes my muscles. My eyelids droop against my will, a sudden paralyzing exhaustion spreading through my veins. Mr. Vance stops his casual story, his unblinking eyes analyzing my crumbling posture. "You look terrible, Elias," he says smoothly. Step outside with me for a quick smoke. The freezing night air will wake you right up, he insists, offering a warm, harmless smile. My clouded brain completely fails to process the red flags, blinded by his fake hospitality. I grab the heavy brass key tag, dragging my sluggish feet away from the safe glass counter. He politely holds the heavy glass lobby door open, stepping back like a true gentleman. I stumble out into the freezing darkness, completely unaware that I just crossed into my own grave. The moment the freezing wind hits my face, a dry metallic click echoes behind me. The lobby door slams shut with a finality that makes my blood turn to ice. I lunge for the handle and pull with all my might, but it remains stubbornly frozen. Mr. Vance had casually pressed the lock while pretending to be a gentleman holding the door. He stands perfectly still on the stairs, blocking the only path back to the warm light. A thick, unlit cigar hangs from his fingers as he stares at me with a hollow gaze. The friendly mask has completely dissolved, leaving only a cold and calculated predatory stare. The sedative is working quite well, isn't it, Elias? His voice is now sharp as a razor. It ensures you cannot run and ensures you cannot find the strength to scream. I chose this rotting motel because I knew this south corner has 0 working cameras. The distance between us vanishes as Vance slowly closes the gap with predatory grace. My brain screams at me to run, but my legs are completely and utterly paralyzed. My knees finally hit the freezing asphalt, a cold reality sinking into my numb flesh. The worst horror isn't facing a monster. It is being trapped inside a dying body. He slowly reaches into his jacket pocket, pulling out a heavy black plastic zip tie. He calmly slides it into a loop, the sharp plastic sound echoing in the void. Crawl toward the van, Elias. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. His polite mask has finally evaporated, leaving behind the cold face of a professional killer. He whistles a low and tuneless melody, as if he is just wrapping a gift. I am an exhausted prey, watching my own death approach without the strength to blink. If I let him drag me into that van, I will vanish from this world without a trace. My physical motor skills are stolen by the drugs, but my survival instinct screams one last time. A sudden surge of raw adrenaline tears through the chemical fog. For just a millisecond, I cannot fight him with my muscles, but I can destroy his greatest weapon, the silence. My trembling fingers grip the heavy, solid brass key tag, hidden beneath my paralyzed palm. I lock my blurry vision on a luxury SUV, parked nearby under the flickering street light. With the desperate strength of a dying animal, I fling the heavy metal with everything I have. The brass tag flies through the cold night air, spinning toward the perfect target. It slams into the side window with a deafening crash, shattering the peace of the night. The silence is finally broken, and the hunter's perfect game of shadows is over. The deafening anti-theft alarm of the luxury SUV screams into the freezing dead of night. Motel room lights flick on one by one as panicked shadows quickly appear behind the curtains. Mr. Vance completely freezes, his lifeless eyes rapidly calculating the sudden mathematical risk. Without a single trace of panic, he turns his back and walks away into the darkness. I collapse heavily onto the freezing asphalt, slipping into a deep unconsciousness as doors open. 3 days later, I wake up in a sterile hospital bed, listening to a chilling police report. Mr. Vance was literally a ghost. His ID belonged to a man who died 5 years ago. He paid entirely in cash and clinically wiped away every single fingerprint from room 214. He is a professional apex predator, wandering quietly from town to town to collect his victims. The ultimate lesson of the night shift. Security cameras only clean up the scene, they don't save you. Death by hypothermia does not torture you with pain. It lulls your mind with deceptively warm hallucinations. I am Arthur, an experienced mountain climber, but experience is completely useless against a deliberate human predator. 2 hours ago, surrounded by a blinding whiteout blizzard, I blindly followed the red trail ribbons on the pines. I never knew someone had moved them into a fake trail, leading straight to a hidden icy drop. The false ground violently collapsed beneath my boots, sending me tumbling down a long, terrifying frozen slope. My heavy survival backpack snagged on a broken branch, instantly tearing away my sleeping bag and fire starter. My 10 freezing fingers have now turned into the sickening purple-black color of severe and irreversible necrosis. Just as my dying brain was about to shut down, I saw a ruined hunter's cabin at the bottom. Through a cracked wooden window, the yellow light of a kerosene lantern gently called out to my freezing soul. I desperately crawled inside and collapsed on the dusty floor, completely unaware I was entering his perfect slaughterhouse. The interior was dark, smelling of mold, moss, and the rotting decay of wild animals. Every gasping breath I took blew in thick layers of dust into heavy clouds of gray smoke. But as my shivering slowly calmed down, my nose was hit by a completely misplaced smell. A rich aroma of roasted hazelnut coffee was violently clashing with the dead atmosphere. I struggled to stand up with my bleeding hands, my eyes fixed on the lonely wooden table. Next to the lantern was a small camping stove, burning with a subtle pale blue flame. An aluminum camping pot was resting on the fire, its lid rattling from the boiling liquid inside. Right next to it sat a perfectly pristine white porcelain cup. The illogical contrast between this ruined cabin and fresh coffee struck my brain like a fatal blow. My stomach churned. This was not an accident, this was a deliberate invitation. My oxygen-deprived brain frantically searched for a logical explanation to justify this terrifyingly cozy setup. Could there be another lost hiker taking shelter here? No, that was completely impossible. I nervously glanced back at the open doorway. The thick snow only carried my own stumbling footprints. A bone-chilling cold suddenly surged through my spine when I looked closely at the wooden floorboards. The thick gray layer of dust was not untouched. It was marked by continuous curved, sweeping lines. Someone had used a pine branch to carefully sweep the floor, erasing their own footprints backward. The most horrifying part was the direction of those marks, slowly retreating into the darkest corner. They started from the table and ended perfectly, right in front of a closed plywood closet. The brutal truth dropped on me like a heavy hammer. The hunter never left this cabin. He was patiently waiting inside that dark closet, eager to watch his frozen prey finally relax. Knowing I was trapped with a killer made the tiny cabin feel completely devoid of oxygen. Amidst the howling winds outside, I began to hear a wet, rhythmic, and terrifyingly close wheezing sound. Wheeze. Wheeze. That suffocated breath was coming directly from the cracks of the dark plywood closet. The broken wooden slats created a tiny black window, no bigger than the palm of my trembling hand. From deep within that absolute darkness, two unnaturally large and unblinking eyes were staring directly at me. He had been standing squeezed inside that narrow box since long before I even opened the door. The figure watched, intently, greedily, consuming the raw terror that was rising within my dilated pupils. The hunter was not in any rush. He was savoring every second of his elaborate predatory game. I stood frozen like a broken doll, unable to draw enough air into my collapsing lungs. The elaborate trap was now fully revealed, leaving me with nowhere left to hide or run. The sick silence was shattered as a giant hand wearing a filthy leather glove pushed the closet door open. A massive man wrapped in patchworked animal skins stepped out, reeking of rotting flesh and old grease. He wore an unnerving, tightly sealed, wide smile, slowly drawing a razor-sharp skinning knife from his belt. My numb legs gave way, forcing me to back up until my spine hit the wooden table, cornered like a desperate animal. A wild and primal survival instinct completely hijacked my frozen brain. As the giant stepped forward, I let out a lung-tearing scream of absolute pure rage. My necrotic hands frantically grabbed the handle of the fiercely burning aluminum camping pot. With every ounce of my dying strength, I hurled the boiling coffee and burning alcohol straight at his face. Scalding liquid splashed against his flesh as the blue flame instantly ignited his thick, greasy beard. The monster dropped his knife, letting out a savage, agonizing roar as he collapsed to the floorboards. Without wasting a single millisecond, I stomped on his burning jacket and dashed into the blizzard, fueled by pure adrenaline. I blindly ran through the freezing storm until my legs completely gave out. My pathetic life was barely saved when a highway snowplow found my frozen body the next morning. Days later in the hospital, the local sheriff revealed a truth that shattered my soul forever. The armed tactical team raided the cabin, discovering the plywood closet was actually a hidden trapdoor. It led down into a freezing underground ice cellar where they found a horrifying and morbid collection. 3 frozen corpses of missing hikers were neatly arranged around a rotting wooden table in the dark. Each dead body was firmly holding a pristine white porcelain cup of that exact same hazelnut coffee. My physical body somehow escaped the woods, but my broken mind will never truly leave that room. Now, every single time I smell hot hazelnut coffee, I feel those dead, unblinking eyes watching me. The freezing midnight delivery shifts completely drained the very last drop of my miserable life force. I am Ethan, 22 years old, trading my absolute safety just to earn a few pathetic coins. The clock struck 2 in the morning, leaving me exhausted while holding a terribly heavy thermal delivery bag. A newly built and eerily silent house sat completely isolated within a pitch-black and empty suburban neighborhood. The delivery app displayed a weird message that immediately made my empty stomach churn with a deep anxiety. I am painting the upstairs room. My hands are dirty, so the front door is completely unlocked. Just push the door open and leave the food right on top of the kitchen island for me. Desperate for a tiny, miserable tip, I willingly threw my own fragile life into an absolute nightmare. I stupidly crossed the glowing threshold without realizing the heavy stench of death quietly stalking my shadow. I was blindly offering myself as an obedient prey to a violently starving and completely deranged beast. The newly built house was completely empty, without a single trace of human warmth. Blinding fluorescent light violently washed over the sickeningly clean and heavily polished wooden floors. My sense of smell was immediately assaulted by a genuinely repulsive mixture of heavy chemicals. The overwhelmingly thick scent of fresh paint was desperately trying to mask the stinging odor of toilet bleach. Right in the middle of that freezing, expansive space sat a single, heavy marble kitchen island. The deeply unnatural silence aggressively squeezed my eardrums until I could hear my own blood rushing. There was absolutely no sound of paint rollers or any normal human activity coming from the upstairs floor. My screaming intuition violently begged me to just drop the food and run away immediately. But I politely pushed my rising panic down and walked briskly toward the cold stone counter. I had no idea that pure evil was patiently hiding right beneath that blindingly bright light. At the very moment I let go of the orange bag onto the freezing cold marble surface, a dry and ruthless metallic sound suddenly echoed, shattering the absolute silence of the room. The sound of the front door deadbolt being turned slowly right behind my back. My blood instantly turned to ice. My chest felt like it was being crushed by a heavy stone. That bloodthirsty monster was never upstairs, like the lies he had typed on the screen. He had been holding his breath, pressing himself against the wall right behind the half-open door. He watched with delight as I willingly walked deeper into this closed trap with no way out. The boundary of safety crumbled. I was now completely isolated from the outside world. The cage had snapped shut, leaving a weak prey alone with a violently starving beast. I tremblingly turned my body around to face the worst nightmare of my entire life. From the shadows of the foyer, the man slowly stepped out under the blindingly bright white lights. He wore a pristine white, short-sleeved shirt without a single drop of dirty paint on it. His pale face was stretched into a wide and terrifyingly polite fake smile that never reached his eyes. "Aren't you going to take your shoes off? I just spent so much effort cleaning these floors." That bone-chillingly calm sentence instantly snatched all the oxygen right out of my terrified lungs. The deadly distance slowly narrowed as he took each rhythmic step with a calculated and predatory grace. His empty, hollow eyes were greedily locked onto me as if I were nothing but a piece of trash. He carried no weapon because he knew for certain that I could never escape this locked house. The brightly lit space with no corners transformed into a cruel and suffocatingly silent slaughterhouse. I backed away in total despair until my waist slammed hard against the sharp edge of the stone island. The sickly, polite mask of his face suddenly twisted into a surge of pure predatory malice. He stretched his long, pale arms forward, preparing to snatch his helpless prey. The despair choking my chest immediately exploded into a wave of wild and primal rage. I refused to become a nameless corpse in this disgusting and empty, pristine house. My survival instinct forced me to frantically grab the terribly heavy orange thermal delivery bag. Inside were the containers of spicy soup, still boiling hot from the order he had placed. With every ounce of my remaining strength, I hurled the bag directly at his grinning face. The fabric bag slammed hard. The lids burst open, splashing the scalding hot soup all over him. The sound of burning flesh mixed with a wet, sizzling noise echoed clearly through the sterile air. I used his own cruel trap to carve out a bloody escape for myself. A piercing scream of agony tore through my eardrums as the man clutched his face and stumbled back. I frantically twisted the heavy metal deadbolt and threw myself out into the freezing night air. I scrambled into my car and floored the gas, my hands shaking as I dialed for help. 15 minutes later, the cold, blue and red sirens finally shattered the darkness surrounding that house. We stormed back into the sterile interior, but the pale devil had already evaporated into the night. He had vanished through the back exit, leaving behind only the cold stench of bleach and burnt soup. The police discovered a "for sale" sign lying discarded and hidden in a dark corner of the yard. The predator had used a burner phone and a vacant property to create the perfect, untraceable slaughterhouse. The monster is still out there, completely invisible, leaving me drowning in the suffocating mud of trauma. I survived that night, but my soul remains forever trapped behind that locked wooden door. There are strange, late-night texts that you must absolutely ignore. I am Liam, an ER doctor who just dragged himself home after an endlessly brutal shift. My body is so exhausted and shattered. It feels like the darkness in the room is swallowing me whole. At exactly 11:30 p.m., the phone in my hand gives a soft, subtle vibration. A toxic blue glare casts harsh shadows across my pale face and bloodshot eyes. An unknown number sends a chillingly blunt message. Is John home? Exhaustion forces my fingers to mindlessly type back. You have the wrong number. Resting right next to my pillow is a heavy metal flashlight, kept for power outages. Sleep heavily drags my eyelids down in the suffocating silence of the bedroom. But little did I know, that single reply had just officially invited death to my door. Less than a few seconds later, the phone vibrates again with a new message. Oh, sorry. Wow, the front of your house looks really nice. The chilling text reads, attached right below it is a picture of my exact house engulfed in the pitch black night. A cold shiver like 1,000 needles pierces down my spine, jolting me wide awake. Psychologically speaking, humans always lie to themselves to rationalize terrifying threats. I desperately convinced myself that scammers were just using old internet photos for blackmail. They just wanted to extort money from easily frightened victims on the internet. I scowled in frustration, tossing the heavy phone aside and squeezing my eyes tightly shut. The space around me was so suffocatingly quiet. I could hear my own heart hammering rapidly. That foolish, arrogant assumption was the absolute worst mistake of my entire life. The phone vibrates violently again, tearing through the deathly silence of the room. This time, primal survival instinct forces me to scramble up and grab the device. My protective shield of denial shatters as the second photo slowly loads. A close-up shot from the front yard, pressed right against my living room window. The yellow porch light in the photo is glowing brightly, radiating a warm, sickly light. That is the exact light I just turned on myself. Less than 10 minutes ago. This isn't an old photo from the internet. This is a live feed of my current life. He is standing out there right now in the suffocating silence of the night. The blood in my veins turns to ice. My stomach knots with a pure, agonizing terror. That faceless monster has been hungry for me for a very long time. I held my breath, crawling off the bed like a cat to avoid making a single sound. I rushed to the bedroom door and violently pressed the metal safety lock into place. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I grabbed the heavy metal flashlight from the nightstand. The phone lit up again, signaling that a third photo had just been sent to my device. This time, he took a picture of my closed wooden bedroom door. The photo was taken from the dark hallway, right inside my own house. My heart felt like it stopped beating. He had picked the lock and entered a long time ago. The absolute suffocating terror choked my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I backed up against the wall, eyes glued to the dark gap under the bedroom door. I gripped the flashlight with white knuckles, cold sweat pouring down as I waited for death to walk in. I poured every drop of sweat-soaked focus into that locked wooden door. My pupils constricted painfully, forced by the harsh, toxic blue glare of the smartphone screen. Suddenly, the screen flickered with one final message sent to my number. It wasn't another photo. It was a polite command that shattered my soul. "Your screen is a bit too bright. Could you please lower the brightness rate right now?" That single sentence froze my entire consciousness, like a thunderbolt to my mind. The hallway photo was a decoy, a cruel psychological trick to make me look away. He wasn't out in the hallway. He was already standing in the dark corner, right behind me. By locking that door, I had successfully trapped myself inside with a cold-blooded killer. My absolute despair suddenly twisted into the frantic, suicidal rage of a cornered rat. The flashlight swing barely grazed his shoulder as the madman lunged at me with a thick cable. In a suffocating, gasping struggle, he wrapped the cord around my throat, pulling it tight. With my lungs burning and absolute desperation taking over, I swung the heavy metal flashlight again and again, aiming for anything I could hit. A sickening crunch of bone and metal. The shadow finally collapsed, his blood staining my wooden floorboards. I crawled into the far corner, my hands shaken and covered in blood as I dialed for help, staring at the motionless shape. 30 minutes felt like a century, submerged in the dark, waiting for the sirens to finally cut through the night. When the police let him out, the flickering porch light revealed his face, and the truth was a new kind of horror. He was the electrician, the man who came to fix the wiring last month, the one I let into my house with a smile. He had duplicated my keys, turning my sanctuary into a silent digital hunting ground. Since that day, I've always been extremely alert, with every dark corner in my own home. This old suburban house was supposed to be the perfect dream for my husband and me, but he just left on a business trip, leaving me completely stranded in this massive empty space. He absolutely hates animals, so Cooper is usually locked outside in the freezing concrete garage. The suffocating loneliness became too much, so I secretly sneaked my dog inside, just for some warmth. I am Maya, a 28-year-old architect, running on pure, nauseating physical exhaustion tonight. It is exactly 2 a.m., and I am desperately trying to swallow A freezing, creeping sense of dread. A yellow box cutter, caked in white drywall dust, lies completely abandoned on my messy wooden desk. Cooper is viciously growling, staring dead ahead at a newly built drywall panel, covering a dark alcove. His unblinking eyes are wide with primal fear, his rigid body anchored perfectly still toward the blank white surface. I just wanted to feel safe tonight, not realizing I had locked myself inside with a living nightmare. I let out a heavy, trembling sigh, trying to rationalize this terrifying situation. Out here in the deep suburbs, wild raccoons crawling into the drywall is practically normal. "It's just an animal, Cooper," I whispered, desperately trying to convince myself. I gently stroked his bristling, stiff fur, but my own hands were shaking uncontrollably. He didn't even flinch, his deep, guttural growl only growing more aggressive. A mix of sheer exhaustion and frustration forced me to step closer to the blank wall. I slowly leaned forward, pressing the side of my head against the cold, freshly painted surface. I closed my eyes tight, fully expecting to hear the frantic scratching of tiny animal claws. The room was so suffocatingly silent, I could distinctly hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. I just wanted my husband to be here, to protect me from the dark. The faint scratching sound suddenly stopped dead, replaced by a sickening heavy silence. A tiny stream of white drywall dust silently drifted down from an unfinished electrical outlet. And then, from mere inches away, a dry, stifled human sneeze vibrated right through the wall. The sound was so painfully close. I could feel the warm breath hitting the other side of the plaster. Every single drop of blood in my body instantly turned into freezing solid ice. My legs completely gave out, leaving me paralyzed and trembling against the baseboard. There was no raccoon in that wall. There was a grown man standing right next to me. He had been standing there, sharing my breaths in the dark for God knows how long. The horrifying realization hit me that every private tear I shed had been an entertainment show. Nausea violently twisted my stomach as pure primal terror completely consumed my mind. My primal survival instincts violently kicked in, forcing me to scramble backward away from the wall. Cooper was barking like a demon, his fangs bared in a terrifying display of protective rage. The entire drywall partition began to shake, vibrating from the force of heavy blows from within. A sudden, violent impact from inside the wall sent the plastic outlet cover flying across the floor. A dark, jagged hole appeared right at the baseboard, like the mouth of a starving beast. I sobbed in absolute, blinding desperation, my hands frantically clawing at the wooden desk behind me. My cold, trembling fingers suddenly struck metal, the hard surface of the yellow box cutter. I gripped the handle with everything I had, clicking the blade forward into its locked position. He wasn't just watching anymore. The monster behind the wall was coming to take my life. The feeling of being cornered turned a terrified woman into a desperate, frantic fighter. Through the jagged hole at the baseboard, a single pale hand slowly reached out. It was covered in white drywall dust, looking exactly like the hand of a corpse. The filthy fingers gripped the thin edge of the plaster, trying to tear it wide open. I could hear him panting heavily, the stench of old basements filling the room. "Don't be so shy," a raspy, calm voice whispered from the darkness. "I watched you open your boxes with that yellow knife yesterday morning. My absolute, paralyzing horror suddenly exploded into a blind, tearful rage. I wouldn't let this happen. I wouldn't let this filth touch a single part of me. With every ounce of strength left in my body, I lunged forward with the box cutter. I screamed until my throat tore, hacking down at those filthy reaching fingers. Dark, thick blood instantly sprayed, staining the pristine white wall behind him. The mechanical click of my car door locking was the only thing keeping my soul from shattering. I drove until the sun came up, staring at the rear view mirror, waiting for a pale hand to reach from the back seat. They caught him in the crawl space. His fingers were a mangled, bloody mess from the blade. The police found a small camera lens hidden inside the electrical outlet I'd been leaning against. He didn't just want to hurt me. He wanted to own every second of my existence. He had a collection of my discarded things, a hair tie, a broken pen, a used coffee cup. My husband came home and held me, but I couldn't feel his touch anymore. We sold the house and moved to a high-rise. But every sound behind the drywall still stops my heart. I spend my nights staring at the corners, waiting for the plaster to crack again. Tell me, when you hear a faint scratching behind your wall tonight, are you absolutely sure it's just a mouse? They always tell you the late-night subway tunnels are peaceful, a quiet place to clear your head. But at exactly 1:30 a.m., that clinical dead silence is actually a sickeningly perfect trap. My chest felt hollow. I'm a 28-year-old auditor, running on pure, nauseating physical exhaustion. Just one last graveyard shift, one final run before I moved away to start fresh. The buzzing fluorescent lights above made the glossy green tiles look almost like a sterile hospital ward. Even the red fire extinguisher bolted to the wall felt unnaturally cold against the lifeless concrete. Missing the final train had left me completely buried alive inside this suffocating airtight box. The only sound was the sharp, lonely echo of my own heels striking the floor. I just wanted my locked apartment door. I wanted to collapse, to stop thinking entirely. Looking back, I should never have taken this desolate shortcut through the lower transfer concourse. I was dragging my heavy feet when I heard a strange, uneven rhythm echoing behind me. It wasn't just footsteps. There was a wet, guttural sniffing sound mixed in between the strides. I nervously glanced over my shoulder, not wanting to seem rude or openly paranoid just yet. A tall man was walking exactly in my direction, wearing an impeccably clean navy blue tailored suit. But my stomach completely dropped when I realized his pale feet were entirely bare and filthy. His face was distorted by an unnaturally wide smile, frozen as if his jaw was paralyzed. He wasn't looking at the path ahead. His wide, unblinking white eyes were glued to my neck. The polite, rational part of my brain whispered, "Just keep walking. Do not provoke him." I desperately quickened my pace, but that wet, greedy sniffing sound only seemed to grow louder. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, struggling to pump air into my rapidly tightening chest. I suddenly realized the wet slaps of his bare feet were syncing perfectly with my own heels. Every time I stepped, he stepped. A flawless, mocking echo designed to play with my mind. I abruptly stopped in my tracks, and the tunnel instantly plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. Slowly, turning around, The polite, rational part of my brain completely shattered into pieces. He was standing exactly 15 feet away, his head tilted at an impossible broken angle. He slowly raised a pale, filthy hand, pressing a long, dirt-caked finger against his lips. His unblinking, dead-white eyes never once broke contact, piercing right through my skull. "Your scent?" A raspy, sickening whisper crawled from his unnaturally frozen, smiling face. "It's so much sweeter in person than in all those photographs." The false sense of safety evaporated, leaving only the raw, blinding panic of a hunted animal. My survival instincts violently kicked in, screaming at me to run before it was too late. Tears blurred my vision entirely as I sprinted like a hunted animal through the concrete maze. Pushing through the final heavy doors, I finally burst into the sterile lobby of my apartment building. The space was completely dead and deserted, making every frantic gasp of air feel painfully loud. I aggressively hammered my bruised knuckles against the elevator call button, begging for the steel doors to open. The heavy, brushed steel doors slowly parted, and I stumbled inside, frantically crawling toward the back wall. The very first thing catching my eye was a familiar red metallic fire extinguisher bolted to the panel. I spun around immediately, pressing the door close button while my chest burned in excruciating pain. The heavy steel panels began sliding together, offering a desperate, fragile sliver of false hope. Leaning my head back against the cold wall, I sobbed quietly, foolishly believing I had actually escaped. Just as the gap narrowed to a few millimeters, a filthy bare foot suddenly jammed inside. The skin was caked in grime, those twisted, crooked toes forcing the heavy steel doors apart. My heart stopped beating entirely. A cold, paralyzing weight crushing my lungs as the opening widened. A pale, skeletal hand reached through, long fingers with jagged nails clawing at the metal edge. I could hear his nails scratching, a sickening metallic screech that vibrated through my very teeth. His distorted, frozen smile pressed against the gap, his eyes unblinking and wide behind the steel. "Don't leave yet," his raspy voice hissed. "I need to keep that beautiful hair for myself." Pure, revolting disgust suddenly snapped, transforming my terror into a blind, white-hot survival rage. I won't die in this box. I won't let this subhuman filth touch a single hair on me. I lunged with a desperate scream, grabbing the cold, red metallic fire extinguisher from the wall. The mechanical click of the elevator locking was the only thing keeping my soul from shattering completely. I reached my apartment door, fumbling with heavy keys before collapsing onto the cold, hard wooden floor. I sobbed until my throat was raw, while the silence of the room felt like a suffocating shroud. They caught him at a medical clinic. His fingers were nothing but a mangled, crushed mess of bone. The police found thousands of photos in his basement. Every single one was of me sleeping, walking, existing. He knew I was moving away. He was desperate to claim a part of me before I vanished. That truth hollowed out my spirit, turning a narrow escape into a lifelong, haunting sentence of pure fear. Years have passed and I've moved cities, but the shadows still seem to follow me into every room. Every time I step into an elevator, I find myself staring at the floor, waiting for a foot. Tell me, are you absolutely sure you're the only one breathing in that room with you right now? People always say the most terrifying thing about working the graveyard shift is the drunks, but they are completely wrong. The absolute worst thing is realizing you are tightly locked inside, especially when a literal murderer is desperately craving to step inside your space. I am Sarah, a city transit security camera monitoring officer working alone. It is currently 3 in the morning, and I am sitting completely isolated in a glass security booth. This surveillance booth is located at station number 4, a place sitting deep underground. I was just desperately trying to earn some extra overtime money to pay off my college debt. Surrounding me right now is absolutely nothing but pale, freezing, and sterile fluorescent lighting, along with a heavy red fire extinguisher lying perfectly still right in the corner of the wall. Its position is sitting right next to the entrance door, an innocent detail I barely noticed. My agonizing drowsiness was completely extinguished the instant I glanced at the camera monitor. At the very end of the desolate eastern tunnel, a towering, gangly-limbed man suddenly appeared. This monstrous figure wore a baggy gray suit, dragging a massive bleeding object. Suddenly, the towering killer abruptly stopped, slowly lifting his pale, deathly, uncanny face. Through the grainy, noisy surveillance screen, his unblinking eyes violently locked onto my security camera. A freezing chill violently raced down my spine. I knew without a doubt he was staring exactly at me. Only 3 painfully short minutes later, the distinct, sickening clack, clack, clack of leather shoes echoed. The horrific sound boomed along the completely empty station platform, counting down my final seconds. Then the man in the suit appeared in the actual flesh, standing like a towering gargoyle just outside my glass booth. He stood there less than half a meter away from me, carrying a sickening scent of rot. He didn't rage or attempt to violently smash the reinforced security glass. His terrifyingly eerie calmness violently suffocated my frantically racing, panicked heart. He slowly tapped his long, bony fingers against the thick, transparent glass panel. Then he pointed his pale finger directly at the CCTV server beneath my desk. "Open the door." His deep, slurred voice leaked through the tiny ventilation holes. "I already called the police," I desperately screamed, backing away from the glass. "You need to leave right now," I yelled out, filled with absolute terrifying despair. A sickening, wicked smile stretched across his completely frozen, deathly pale face. "They're 15 minutes away. This only takes 10 seconds if you cooperate. Unlock the door, I take the drive, and you live. Don't make this ugly." "Never. Just stay the hell away from me," I screamed, backing tightly against the freezing wall. I was completely cornered inside this tiny glass cage, with absolutely nowhere left to run. Seeing my desperate refusal, his hollow eyes darkened with an overwhelmingly thick, murderous intent. He slowly took a few steps back, disappearing briefly into the dim maintenance shadows. When he returned, his pale hands were firmly holding a bright red, deadly spare gas can. Without a single word of warning, he tilted the heavy container toward the narrow transaction slot. The thick amber liquid violently gushed inside, pooling rapidly onto the security booth's tiled floor. The suffocating toxic stench of raw gasoline immediately filled the air, making me cough hysterically. My tiny safe haven had instantly transformed into a suffocating gas chamber ready to ignite. He casually reached into his baggy suit pocket, pulling out a gleaming silver metal lighter. The sharp metallic click of his lighter echoed, a small orange flame violently reflecting in my wide eyes. The heat of impending death was already burning my face. But my frantic brain suddenly sparked a plan. He needs the drive. He cannot risk destroying his precious evidence with a violent, messy gasoline explosion. I buried my face in my hands and sobbed uncontrollably, letting my shoulders shake with fake, broken despair. I let my hands drop limply to my sides, pretending my will to survive had completely crumbled into pieces. "Please, don't. I will open it, I sobbed, slowly walking toward the heavy door. Seeing his prey finally surrender, he extinguished the flame and used both hands to reach for the handle. The heavy security latch clicked dryly as he violently pushed the thick reinforced glass door wide open. His greedy eyes were immediately locked onto the server drive, completely ignoring the small broken girl behind the door. Right at that exact second, my right hand firmly gripped the heavy red fire extinguisher hidden in the corner. He let out a muffled, distorted scream, violently clutching his chemically burned, blinded eyes. The towering figure stumbled back and slipped, crashing hard onto the very gasoline puddle he poured. Without wasting a single millisecond, I trampled over his thrashing body to reach the light. I burst through the booth door and ran, my footsteps echoing like gunshots through the hollow station. I scrambled up the freezing concrete stairs, desperately gasping for a single breath of clean, safe air. I didn't stop until I felt the biting wind of the city street and saw the distant flicker of life. 10 minutes later, the blue and red police lights arrived, washing the cold stone entrance in flickering color. They searched every inch of the deep tunnels, but the man in the suit had vanished into the shadows. The white foam and the heavy scent of gasoline were the only proof that I hadn't simply lost my mind. "You were incredibly lucky," the officer whispered, "but I still feel those eyes watching from the dark." Camping alone. I almost lost my life. Not to the weather, but to an absolute lunatic. Those bare footprints stamped into the negative 15-degree snow. They still haunt me to this very day. I am Mark, just a completely ordinary office worker trying to find some quiet, isolated space. Late last December, I drove up to the remote Cascades for a relaxing solo winter trip. A massive blizzard hit 2 days earlier than forecasted, trapping me tight in the desolate woods. With absolutely zero cell service, I didn't dare risk blindly fumbling 30 meters to my car. I had to bunker down inside my tiny tent, desperately hoping to survive the freezing cold night. I kept reassuring myself, "Hold on, Mark. You just need to wait until the morning light." Near dawn, the storm finally stopped, leaving a silence so deep I could hear my heartbeat. Right at that exact moment, a loud, crunching sound echoed clearly from just outside the tent. At first, I desperately tried to convince myself it was just a stray deer passing by. But wild animals never walk with such a slow, deliberate, and purposeful rhythm like that. I shivered as I shifted my body, like peering through the mesh vent that was half frozen shut. The snow outside was pristine and flat, yet deep, sunken impressions began appearing before my eyes. A cold shiver ran down my entire spine when I realized those weren't heavy boot prints. Every single toe and the curve of the heel were clearly visible, pressed deep into the snow. Good God, who would walk barefoot in this freezing weather? I thought to myself in terror. A normal human would suffer from frostbite and necrosis within just a few agonizing minutes. My brain screamed in alarm, telling me the whatever survived this cold was definitely not normal. It didn't groan or cry out for any help. It just kept walking in that eerie silence. I held my breath, paralyzed by a fear so cold it felt like ice in my veins. Through that tiny frosted mesh vent, my eyes desperately traced the path of the tracks. Contrary to what I hoped, the madman outside was not disappearing into the dark forest. He was slowly walking in a perfect, terrifying circle around my fragile, thin nylon shelter. Walking barefoot allowed him to move without the heavy, crunching sounds of winter boots. My stomach churned as I realized I was being toyed with, like prey in a glass cage. I followed the final set of prints, and then my entire body turned to stone. The tips of his toes were pointing directly at the fabric wall right behind my back. "Who's out there? I have a gun!" I managed to scream with a trembling, broken voice. But the only response to my desperate threat was a heavy, suffocating, and deathly silence. The distance between my skin and that uncanny creature is just a thin layer of nylon. The cramped air inside the tent feels like it's being sucked out, making me breathe hard. Dawn begins to break, unintentionally cast in a pitch-black shadow onto the yellow fabric wall. He slowly hunches down, so close that he blocks out every bit of the faint morning light. A slow, wheezing breath echoes, blowing moist, warm air onto the freezing outside of the tent. The foul, sickening stench of a body that hasn't bathed in ages seeps into my space. Suddenly, a raspy, distorted voice speaks right next to my ear. "So cold. Open the door." Those sick, malevolent words shatter every desperate effort I made to stay calm all night. I can't run anymore. A massive hand silhouette slowly reaches out to touch the fabric surface. He begins to fiddle with the zipper, the scratching sound tearing through my very last neurons, the sound of the tent zipper slowly ridding up, slow, grinding, and agonizingly sharp against the silence. A narrow, dark gap begins to appear, bringing in a sudden gust of blizzard wind like ice knives. He thrusts a bare, unprotected hand inside the tent. No gloves, no gear, just raw, freezing skin. His flesh is deathly white, while his fingertips have already turned a sickening, necrotic shade of deep purple. "I'm coming in now," he whispers, in a ghostly, disjointed voice that sounds like grinding gravel. Primitive survival instincts suddenly surge through me. I know I'll die if I stay silent and still. My right hand tightly grips the heavy, cold metal flashlight, resting heavily in the dark corner. "Get the hell away from here." I scream with primal rage as I swing with all my strength. The heavy steel flashlight smashes directly into those purple, frozen fingers, crushing them against the metal floor. He lets out a low, guttural groan of pain, quickly retracting his mangled hand as the zipper breaks. Without wasting a single second, I threw my shoulder through the tent door and started running for my life. I stumbled and fell onto the deep, soft snow, but immediately scrambled back up toward my parked car. Fumbling with my keys with violently trembling hands, I dove inside and immediately locked every single door. The engine roared to life, and I blasted the heater to its maximum, yet my body wouldn't stop shaking. Through the frost-covered windshield, the thin fabric tent sat lonely and abandoned against the endless white snow. Hours later, after the storm finally cleared, my phone finally found a signal to call the police. They eventually arrived at the scene, tracing those horrific bloody footprints leading straight into the dark pine woods. That barefoot, insane man had simply evaporated as if he never truly existed in this world at all. "You were actually incredibly lucky," the lead officer whispered while staring down at the pool of dark blood. "You will never truly understand the fragility of life until you are left completely and utterly alone. Never trust your life to a device that doesn't require a physical key." This morning, my Ring camera caught a phantom manipulating the smart lock I was so proud of. My name is David, a freelance coder who works through the night and rarely leaves the house. I moved into this rundown ground floor apartment on the edge of the city because the rent was dirt cheap. To feel safe, I armored the place with every piece of smart home technology I could afford. The only dumb, purely physical object here is the heavy red metal fire extinguisher mandated by the building. Tuesday morning, taking a break from my screens, I checked last night's camera logs. My stomach tied itself into a cold, heavy knot. At exactly 3:14 a.m., a man in a dark gray hoodie stood motionless at my door. He didn't knock. He just touched the digital keypad once, exactly like he did the 3 nights before. I tremblingly zoomed in on the video from the third night. He wasn't swiping the keypad with his fingers. He held a black digital cloning device in his hand, its faint blue light pulsing. He was pressing it against the glass of the smart lock to brute force the Bluetooth signal. I called the police, but the dispatcher just yawned over the phone. "He hasn't broken the lock and hasn't stolen anything, right? Install more cameras, kid," he said before hanging up. They didn't understand the invisible threat creeping through my walls. My phone app reported the smart lock's battery had dropped from 80% to 15% in just 3 nights. The system was failing, exhausted from fighting off constant targeted attacks. My safe digital cocoon was quietly, terrifyingly cracking open. On the 4th night, I sat on the cold floor of the hallway, refusing to sleep. My eyes were glued to the live feed on my glowing smartphone screen. At exactly 3:10 a.m., the app suddenly glitched, the screen freezing into a pixelated mess. A notification popped up. "Wi-Fi connection lost. Camera offline." He hadn't just returned. He had brought a selective signal jammer with him. I was completely blind, trapped in a digital blackout of his making. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by my own erratic heartbeat. Then I heard it, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of footsteps right outside my front door. I slowly crawled forward and pressed my eye against the cold glass of the peephole. He was standing right there, looking directly into the lens, holding the black box against my lock. Through the distorted glass of the peephole, I saw him, just one layer of wood away, and then my smart lock betrayed me. It emitted a frantic, chaotic series of beeps, the light flashing a violent yellow. The internal manual latch began to rotate on its own, driven by a hidden mechanical force. I lunged forward, grabbing the cold metal with both hands, trying to hold it back. "No, you're not opening," I screamed in a silent, desperate prayer. But the electric motor was being forced into overdrive, a high-pitched whine shrieking in the air. The metal block began to heat up, the smell of burning plastic filling the hallway. My palms were burning, but I couldn't let go, my knuckles turning white with strain. The expensive device meant to protect me was now crushing my strength to invite the devil inside. Beep! A long, cold chime echoed through the hallway, cutting off my final resistance. The indicator light on the lock turned green, the color of safety, now my death sentence. The heavy old wooden door slowly pushed inward, bringing with it the sour stench of his sweat. He stepped half a foot over the threshold, his fingers still gliding over the cloning device, confident his prey had surrendered. In that moment, if technology had betrayed me, I would use the methods of the prehistoric age. I took a step back on the wooden floor and grabbed the heavy red metal fire extinguisher off the wall. Its 10-pound weight rested in my hands, heavy and more real than any app. As he poked his head through the door, I swung that red metal block with all my might. No matter how advanced his cloning device was, its plastic shell and his knuckles shattered under the sheer weight of pure physics. He collapsed right at the threshold of my apartment, letting out a primal, agonizing shriek. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his mangled arm, and vanished into the darkness like a wounded animal. The police arrived the next morning, but all they found were the shattered pieces of his cloning device. That same afternoon, I ripped the smart lock out of the door frame with a crowbar. I threw the cameras, the AI speakers, and the electronic sensors into the trash where they belonged. In their place, I installed a heavy, solid brass deadbolt and a thick steel door chain. People say technology brings peace of mind, that green indicator lights are the symbol of safety. They're wrong. Now, the only thing that allows me to close my eyes at night is the cold, heavy weight of real steel. On my nightstand sits that same dented red fire extinguisher, a silent, scarred witness. I no longer trust the screen. I only trust the weight of the iron and the sound of my own ears. If you drive down Route 66 at 2 in the morning, you realize the darkness here is entirely wrong. It feels completely heavy, almost clinical, pressing down on the hood of your car like a physical weight. That night, after a grueling 16-hour shift, I was just a hollow shell gripping the steering wheel. The only thing keeping me from drifting off into the abyss was the heavy steel thermos resting beside me. It sat motionless on the passenger seat, filled with black coffee, cold to the touch, weighing almost 2 pounds. I remember slowly tapping my fingers against its metallic surface, telling myself I only had 50 miles left. Just 50 more miles of this completely deserted stretch before I could finally lock my front door. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on the illuminated dashboard, ignoring the suffocating emptiness outside my cracked window. The cold air inside the cabin felt completely sterile, softly masking the faint scent of dry desert dust. But something else was quietly waiting for me at mile marker 42, hiding just beyond the reach of my headlights. I saw the rusted sedan first. Its hood gaped open like a dead animal's mouth. Hissing steam curled into the indigo sky, a thin, white veil that felt entirely too quiet. And then the headlights caught her, standing there in a muted yellow floral dress. It was a soft, sickly shade of yellow, far too clean for the grime of the Mojave. She didn't move as my car crawled closer. She just stood there with a clinical stillness. Her head was tilted at an impossible angle to the left, as if her neck had forgotten its purpose. I slowed down, my heart hammering a dull, wet rhythm against my ribs. A survivor's instinct, screaming to stay back. Her lips began to peel back into a wide, stretching smile, revealing teeth that looked like dull ivory. But her eyes, those massive, hollowed-out eyes, remained entirely fixed and unblinking. They stared at a point just behind my car, watching something I couldn't yet see in the darkness. The chill of the high desert air crawled through the 2-inch gap I allowed. A thin sliver of safety. It brought with it the overwhelming scent of cheap, cloying perfume, mixed with the sharp tang of burning motor oil. My car died. "Can you give me a ride?" she asked, her voice entirely flat. It had no inflection, no soul, repeating like a warped cassette tape stuck in a loop. I was about to open my mouth to say no, to just drive away and never look back. But then my eyes slipped downward, sliding past her floral dress and settling on the shadows beneath her car. My heart stopped, a cold, wet hand squeezing the breath from my lungs, blood turning to ice in my veins. Under the sedan, 2 heavy steel-toed boots poked out. But they weren't lying flat as if someone was fixing the engine. The toes were dug into the dirt, pointed directly at my door, a runner coiled and ready to spring. He wasn't fixing a car. He was waiting for the signal to finish what she had started. She caught my eyes and the mask finally shattered, the fake warmth of her smile rotting away. A low, guttural hiss tore through the air as she lunged, slamming her pale face against the window. The 2-inch gap was no longer a sliver of safety. It was an invitation for her madness. Her fingers, thin and skeletal, forced their way through, clawing at the glass like starving spiders. I could hear her fingernails tearing into the rubber seal. A wet, rhythmic scratching that filled the cabin. Out of the corner of my eye, the second shape moved. The mechanic was no longer hiding. He rose from the shadows behind my car, dragging a solid steel crowbar across the dark asphalt. The metal screeched against the road, throwing dull sparks. A predator marking his territory with every heavy step. I reached for the gear stick, my palms slick with cold sweat. But the transmission groaned and jammed. I was trapped in a metal box, and the monsters were no longer pretending to be human. Adrenaline flooded my system as the gear stick remained stubbornly stuck. A cold, mechanical betrayal. The engine roared in a futile metallic protest, but the wheels only spun in the dry desert sand. The mechanic was inches away now, the solid steel crowbar raised high like a headsman's axe. I could see the reflection of the blue moonlight glinting off the cold iron, a jagged promise of violence. Beside me, those skeletal fingers were finally hooking around the door lock, slowly pulling it upward. The click of the safety latch releasing was the loudest sound I've ever heard. The final barrier falling away. I didn't think. There was no room for thought, only the raw primal urge to stay alive. My hand lunged for the passenger seat, gripping the freezing heavy steel of the thermos. Its weight felt divine. I swung it with every ounce of terror and strength left in my broken body, aiming for the fingers in the gap. The impact was sickeningly solid, followed by a sharp, wet crack that finally ended her smile. He slipped away from my door handle by a mere millisecond, his shadow melting back into the asphalt. I stared at the rear view mirror until the darkness of Route 66 swallowed them whole. 2 stains on the night. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't even lift them from the wheel. Cold, useless things. I never drove that stretch of road again. I made a silent, desperate pact with the desert. Years have passed now, but the trauma remains as fresh as a new wound, festering in the quiet moments. Every time I see a broken car on the shoulder, my stomach churns with a cold, visceral dread. The scent of cheap, cloying perfume or the sound of a dry branch snapping. It all brings her back. On my desk right now sits that same heavy stainless steel thermos, a silent, scarred witness to that night. I never washed the lower rim. The dried blood has turned to a dark, rust-like stain on the metal. I often shiver and wonder what would have happened if I'd lowered the window 3 inches instead of 2. People say a blizzard is when you feel the absolute safest inside your own home. Every door is locked tight. No one can penetrate from the freezing white world outside. But I learned the hard way that this absolute safety is just a lie. I am Maya. That December night, I was completely alone in my isolated wooden cabin. A massive snowstorm had entirely cut off our neighborhood, completely severing us from the outside. At exactly 12 minutes past 3 in the morning, I woke up abruptly from deep sleep. Not because of a noise. The house was unnervingly silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. My throat burned terribly, like I had just swallowed a handful of jagged broken glass. I wrapped a thin coat around myself, dragging my bare feet across the freezing floorboards. I blindly pushed the bathroom door open, completely unaware I was locking myself with a monster. The bathroom was pitch black, only a faint amber light bleeding through the wooden door gap. In the freezing temperature, I shivered, pulled my sweatpants down, and sat on the porcelain. It was supposed to be freezing cold, like solid ice, but it absolutely was not. My stomach instantly knotted into a tight, heavy ball, violently twisting and turning completely inside out. The porcelain surface radiated a blazing, humid heat, sticky with fresh, lingering human sweat. It didn't just stop at my pale skin. That sickening heat violently pierced through my spine. It was so disturbingly warm, as if someone had just stood up a split second ago, right before my trembling hand turned the doorknob. Someone was sitting exactly where I was. All the warm blood entirely drained from my body, leaving me utterly paralyzed in silent terror. My brain screamed a brutal physical truth. A living creature had just pressed their flesh here. I held my breath entirely, slowly forcing my weak, trembling legs to stand back up. My small enclosed bathroom usually smelled of sweet vanilla. Not this sharp, sickening metallic rust. A foul, sour stench of unwashed human sweat hung heavily in the freezing, trapped air. My frantic eyes darted wildly around the shadows, finally locking on to the white ceramic sink. My personal toothbrush. The bristles were dripping a tiny, fresh bead of foamy white toothpaste. Someone had just used it. The realization hit my chest like a heavy lead weight. Tick. A very dry, hollow sound echoed as something tiny dropped onto my pale hand. I stared down blankly, recognizing a rotting, filthy splinter of old, decaying wooden ceiling board. And then I heard it. A violently suppressed, rattling breath, desperately trying to stay quiet. Someone was fiercely biting their own lip, hiding directly inside the trap door above my head. My neck joint went entirely rigid, like molten lead was slowly poured into the bone. Primitive instinct fiercely warned me. Absolutely under no circumstances should I look up. Directly above me was the wooden trapdoor leading to the freezing attic space. He didn't sneak down just for toilet use. He was enjoying my heat, using my things, and then frantically scrambling back up when he heard my slippers. Freezing cold sweat was pouring out, completely soaking the back of my neck. Are you listening to this in your bathroom? looking for black shadows overhead. I fiercely darted my bloodshot eyes sideways towards the foggy, spotted mirror on the wall. The mirror's imperfect angle perfectly reflected the black, swallowing void of the attic hatch. The wooden trapdoor above me was slightly ajar, exposing that consuming darkness. In the foggy glass, I saw 4 swollen, filthy fingers clutching the wooden edge. They were straining with immense effort, trying to keep the hatch from making a sound. Behind that narrow gap, a bloodshot, mindless eye was staring directly at my head. He was waiting to see if I'd finally discovered his hiding place. If I screamed, he would jump down. I had no weapons and no escape. I forced my twitching facial muscles to relax, pretending I was still just half asleep. I stretched my arms and let out a long, fake yawn, scratching my head tiredly. I muttered in a flat, dead voice, "Oh man, I forgot my water glass downstairs." My trembling hand reached out and fiercely flushed the toilet. A roaring wave of water. I used that loud noise to hide the choking sob in my throat and walked out the second my bare foot hit the hallway rug. I ran like absolutely never before. I sprinted straight out into the violent blizzard, screaming and pounding on my neighbor's front door. The police arrived quickly, dragging that filthy man out from the tiny space above my ceiling. He was a desperate drifter hiding from the winter storm. But that wasn't the worst part. They found a disgusting little nest, meticulously built using all my stolen, unwashed underwear. He had even woven a bizarre twisted bracelet using the dead hair collected from my shower drain. He didn't want to murder me. He was completely delusional, believing we were a happy family. I moved out immediately, but every single night I still stare intensely at the ceiling vents. Are you sitting in your bathroom right now, listening to this podcast alone in the quiet? Look up at the ceiling vent. Are you absolutely sure that dark shadow is just dust? There is an unwritten rule that the Appalachian locals always whisper to each other. If you hear a sudden whistle in the deep woods, never reply, just keep your head down and walk. I am Elias, an experienced long-distance backpacker traversing these ancient mountains. I always carry a reliable physical compass, detailed topographic maps, and a heavy survival knife. I absolutely never believed in those childish ghost stories about skinwalkers or vengeful spirits. To my highly logical mind, a random whistle was simply another hiker calling out for his lost dog. I felt completely safe walking alone, surrounded only by the rustling leaves and tall pine trees. But the sheer hubris of a man trusting only in modern science blinded me entirely. It made me completely forget the most primal and ancient law of nature. In the brutal food chain of the wild, an off-guard human is the absolute weakest prey. On the 3rd day of my journey, a sharp, lingering whistle echoed from the left hillside. Assuming it was just a friendly hiker, I foolishly pursed my lips and whistled a short reply. Only a few seconds passed before the exact same pitch echoed back into the quiet air. But this time, the sound came from directly behind my back, completely cutting off my retreat. The source had covered massive ground in seconds, moving with the sheer speed of a hunting predator. Suddenly, right on the narrow dirt trail ahead, a towering silhouette blocked the path. The tall man stood completely still with his back turned, firmly gripping a heavy metal machete. The whistle behind me and the armed blocker ahead formed a perfect, inescapable pincer movement. This was a herding tactic, deliberately forcing me to panic and veer off the safe trail. I blindly scrambled down the steep, root-covered slope, voluntarily walking into the slaughterhouse. After 10 minutes of violently sliding down the steep slope, I hid behind a massive, rotting oak root. As my heavy boot pressed deep into the dry leaves, I heard a distinct metallic clank. I carefully brushed away the sawdust, revealing a green military surplus ammo can buried in the dirt. Knowing I could not contaminate the scene, I wrapped my jacket sleeve tightly over my hand. I gently released the metal latch and cracked the heavy steel lid open. A stagnant wave of industrial plastic and rust-preventive oil immediately hit my face. This was no camping gear. Inside were rolls of silver duct tape, thick plastic zip ties, and a folding metal saw. There were heavy industrial trash bags and a sealed bottle of biological dissolving chemical. My blood ran completely cold. This was a professional serial killer's hidden kill kit. They bury these kits months in advance, herd the victim to the exact coordinates, and begin the slaughter. Snap. The sharp sound of a breaking dry branch echoed less than 30 meters away. He was approaching steadily, his footsteps calm and confident, like a trapper checking a cage. Relying on my primal instincts, I used my jacket sleeve to silently snap the metal latch closed. I brushed the sawdust and dry leaves perfectly back into place, erasing the visual anomaly entirely. Snapping a small pine branch, I slowly walked backward, sweeping away every single boot print from the soil. 5 meters away from the oak roots lay a shallow, murky forest creek. I stepped backward into the freezing water, letting the current wash away my human scent and the mud from my soles. Then I laid my entire body flat on my back into the dark, freezing water. I scooped up handfuls of thick, dark mud, aggressively smearing it over my face, my jacket, and any bright colors. The freezing October water sliced through my skin as I closed my eyes to tiny slits, waiting for the monster. The heavy footsteps stopped completely right next to the rotting oak root. Through a tiny gap in the leaves, I saw his heavy, dark hiking boots standing perfectly still. He slowly bent down. If the ammo can was even slightly misaligned, he would immediately draw his machete. The freezing creek water was aggressively stripping away my core body temperature. My muscles spasmed violently, and my physical teeth chattered uncontrollably from severe hypothermia. I forced myself to bite deep into the rotting mud at the bottom of the creek to silence my own body. Vile metallic-tasting mud flooded my mouth, while unseen leeches firmly attached to my freezing neck. His hand swept over the camouflage. Finding the surface completely undisturbed, he let out a satisfied grunt. Standing back up, he whistled that exact same piercing tune into the empty air, hunting a ghost. Receiving no answer, he assumed I had blindly panicked into the deep valley and finally walked away. I laid submerged in that freezing mud for 5 agonizing hours until absolute darkness swallowed the forest. When I finally crawled out, my muscles were completely stiff and my lips were physically turning a dark purple. Walking off trail in the pitch black woods meant falling off a cliff. So I followed the ultimate survival rule. I waded downstream through the freezing water, knowing a small creek eventually leads to human infrastructure. After 3 hours of stumbling through the current, the stream led me to a concrete drainage pipe crossing a paved highway. I flagged down a passing patrol car, and federal agents immediately excavated the hidden military ammo can. The killer had meticulously wiped everything with medical alcohol, but he made one microscopic error. Forensics pulled a partial fingerprint stuck to the inner adhesive side of the silver duct tape, an impossible place to clean. He was captured 2 months later. Just a normal, soft-spoken carpenter with a wife and 2 young daughters. The Appalachian woods hold no ancient demons, just a massive green curtain hiding the boundless cruelty of our own kind.